The Iranians are saying, you attacked us for no reason. You've destroyed our infrastructure, you have destroyed things, you've killed our leadership, you have frozen our assets, and we must enter into an agreement which does not amount to a surrender. Therefore, unfreeze our assets. Therefore, acknowledge that we have control over the Strait of Hormuz. Therefore, acknowledge that we have always been consistent in saying that we don't want a nuclear device. Then ensure that you end the blockade. Ensure that we are able to participate in international commerce like any other country. That is what I hear the Iranians to be saying. The Americans on the other side, and in my view, egged on by the Israelis, are insisting that there must be a total surrender. We must be in occupation, not in real terms, but in virtual terms, in terms of ensuring that their nuclear facilities are under our control. Iran must never have a nuclear device. Israel is the bully, and this bully has now become rogue. And because it is so rogue, there is nothing you can do. But yet I believe that the only country in the world that can bring Israel to order is the United States of America. If the United States of America were to cut the pipeline of dollars that is going to Israel, I can tell you within 1 week, Israel would be forced to withdraw from South Lebanon, they would be forced to withdraw from Gaza, and they would begin to behave. You know, the situation in Iran and therefore the Middle East and the Strait of Hormuz are seen in the context of the involvement of the United States of America has many moving parts. We'll remember that the motivation for the United States of America, urged on by Israel, has always been that Iran must never have a nuclear device. And the Israelis argue that the Iranians are vowed to push them out of the map and call them that Zionist entity. But to their credit, and this happened during the presidency of Ahmadinejad and even during the supreme leadership of Khamenei, they said, we want nuclear for peaceful purposes. And I think the International Atomic Energy has inspected Iran. Iran is perhaps the most inspected country in terms of its compliance. And when the Obama administration in the United States sought to exact some kind of undertakings from the Iranian administration, they did so. And the Iranians then allowed for periodic inspections to ensure that the enrichment of uranium did not reach weapons grade. And I think that has been the situation until, of course, we had the recent spurt starting in the month of February 2026. And it must be remembered that at that time, the Israelis had, of course, on the 7th of October 2023, the incidents that led to the invasion of Gaza and the occupied areas and ultimately into Lebanon. And then the Israelis said that the Iranians were supporting the Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. So you could see that that was the whole idea of trying to draw Iran into this arrangement. And we will remember that immediately that happened, the Omanis started to negotiate or to conduct indirect negotiations between Iran and the United States. And it's not lost on those who are keen that when the attacks started on the 28th of February 2026, an Omani envoy was actually airborne on his way to the United States of America to convey what the Iranians were saying. And we know what has now happened is that for the first time, the Americans were dragged into this space in a very, very fundamental way. And prior to that, there was the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. This is what brought about the early negotiation. So what we see now must also be understood from this perspective. That when the Americans went into Venezuela, and this is my interpretation, and got Maduro and his wife and brought them to the United States of America, they assumed that they could do the same with Iran, not to pick the supreme leader, but that they could prosecute this war very quickly. Little did they know that the Iran administration was a lot more prepared and has always been in a state of preparedness. Little did they know that their bases within that region are vulnerable. Little did they know that the Strait of Hormuz is a significant maritime route which affects international supply chains. And they now find themselves in a situation where it is not easy to proceed. And this is a very unpopular war in the United States, apart from the constituency that supports Donald Trump, which constituency, as most people know, is a constituency that does not ask many questions. They think this is in the context of making America great again. So an unpopular war at home, you find yourself in a war where you are spending nearly $1 billion on a daily basis and you are not addressing the issue. Because what is the reason? The reason is we don't want you to have a nuclear device. Do you achieve it by doing what they have done? The answer is they do not know. They claim that they bombed certain things, but they also don't know whether Iranian nuclear capability is still alive and therefore lends itself to enrichment at a later date. And they underestimated the situation, which I think is what motivated the negotiations which we have seen initially starting in Qatar. Qatar then got involved. Then we saw the Pakistanis getting involved leading up to the Islamabad Accord. The Islamabad Accord is one which is, in my view, driven by a number of things. The Iranians are saying, you attacked us for no reason. You've destroyed our infrastructure, you have destroyed things, you've killed our leadership, you have frozen our assets, and we must enter into an agreement which does not amount to a surrender. Therefore, unfreeze our assets. Therefore, acknowledge that we have control over the Strait of Hormuz. Therefore, acknowledge that we have always been consistent in saying that we don't want a nuclear device. Then ensure that you end the blockade. Ensure that we are able to participate in international commerce like any other country. That is what I hear the Iranians to be saying. The Americans on the other side, and in my view, egged on by the Israelis, are insisting that there must be a total surrender. We must be in occupation, not in real terms, but in virtual terms, in terms of ensuring that their nuclear facilities are under our control. So when you look at the entire scenario, and it must be remembered that the Islamabad Accord is already being breached, that there have been tit-for-tat attacks by the Americans and tit-for-tat attacks by the Iranians. So the question as to whether the Islamabad Accord is holding is one that still awaits for clear examination. We also know that a very closely related understanding between Hezbollah and the Israelis is also being tested on a daily basis. But if one were to be asked a linear question, who has won? In my view, the Iranians have. Because the Americans assumed for one moment that this was a weak civilization, a weak administration. In fact, the President of the United States of America is on record as saying, we are going to wipe them out. We are going to bomb them into the dark ages. And it turned out that is not as easy as they thought it would be. Now their noses are blooded. The Europeans are not interested. They have said they are not going to be involved. And all the attempts, and we saw the very early days when there was false flagging, when it was claimed that the Iranians had attacked some island in the Indian Ocean. And we know this was an attempt to draw in the Europeans who have refused. So when one assesses the situation in this war, and if historians were to respond to the question as to whether there is a victor or a loser in a straightforward sense, they say the Iranians, who were attacked first, have won the moral war. They have won the military war. They have won the propaganda war. And America is the weaker. And I listen quite keenly to what is emanating from the United States of America. The Senate of the United States of America actually sat down and said, we don't want our president to continue prosecuting this war, which is an admission of the fact that the war did not go in the direction that it was designed to go. That is the state of the war as it stands today. You know, whenever we make this very tenuous comparison between what happened in Iran and Venezuela, we must do so in the context of understanding the politics of oil. And the politics of oil is that conservative estimates suggest that perhaps Venezuela has the highest deposit of untapped oil in the world. And America took the view that Maduro, by being inclined to Russia and China, was denying them access. And that is why when he was taken out, he was simply being taken out as somebody who was standing in their way. And the rhetoric now is that we are now in control of Venezuelan oil, we are now in control of the administration, and we can do what we want. Once you do that, in terms of international relations, you then destabilize the Iranians. And when you destabilize the Iranians, remember, you have sanctioned the Iranians, you are sanctioning the Russians, and you, in my view, want to control the entire international economic arena. And we go back to history. America has tried to do this before. In 1973, during the Kissinger years, the whole idea was to ensure that they were in control of production and therefore pricing of oil. That is how we came up with OPEC. And when OPEC came, that is how we moved away from gold anchored currency into the fiat currency of the United States of America and the Petro-Dollar. So there are many moving parts. And those moving parts is a question of the United States seeing that it's losing its leverage internationally. And despite the arguments that we make that we are moving away from fossil fuel, the engine of the world economy is still fossil fuel. And in addition to that, liquefied gas. And that area is very critical in terms of the production that it makes. And number two, remember, people did not know the significance, but possibly of the Suez Canal and therefore the Strait of Hormuz in terms of the equidistance that it enjoys to almost every other part of the world. So all these factors conjoin tell you that these skirmishes or wars that we are seeing, there is a line or something that connects each one of them. And those who are thinking for the United States of America, those who are thinking for Israel, are acutely aware of this, that you have a United States whose currency is threatened. You have a world that is moving into multi-polarity with the emergence of the BRICS. You have a world that is beginning to think of a non-Western controlled economy, and People are uncomfortable in the United States of America. People are uncomfortable in Europe. People are uncomfortable in the United States, in the United Arab Emirates area, and in that particular area that you call the Middle East, whether they're in Qatar or in Bahrain or in Saudi Arabia or in Oman. They are uncomfortable. And Iran is significant. This is a country which is Muslim, but is Shia Muslim. It is not Sunni. And it is the single country that is, in terms of military capability, a counterweight to Israel, which is the bully in the region and which bullies on behalf of the United States of America. So when you look at all these factors, you can see Venezuela is irritating on the other side by controlling oil. Of course, Iran is also irritating on this side, and you want to control all the levers. And in the mind of the United States of America and her president, to make America great again is to look inside, but using resources from outside. That is my view. You know, there is a beautiful French saying that I love, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. That the more things change, the more they remain the same. And those who are mocking the Trump administration are saying, but this is where we were with Obama. Why did you need to go through all this extent? Why shouldn't you just have implemented what was agreed between the Iranian administration and the Obama administration? And he has no answer. He has no answer to that because, in my view, he was drawn into a war. And people forget, Israel has always wanted a direct confrontation with Iran, because they know everybody else in the region is neutered. All the Arab countries are neutered in that, except Iran. And when Israel, for example, talks about the Samson option taken from the Jewish Torah and from the Christian Bible, when Samson destroyed the Philistines and himself, they actually say, we want to confront these fellows, and if they were to use a nuclear device, we are going to use a nuclear device, and even if we are destroyed, everybody in this region would be destroyed. And when you listen to some of the right-wing, far-right political leaders in Israel, you can see even the appetite for that. You can see the appetite. Let's push them to the brink. And if it becomes necessary, let us decimate them. When you interpret the language that we are going to destroy them and to destroy that civilization, that is thinking that is in people's minds. But as you have rightly posed, from a layman perspective, it is this big bully who came, thought that they would eliminate this little boy, little girl in one day. Several months down the line, nothing has happened. The bully has been saying he has used all his stones, which means all his missiles and all his drones, but somehow when you start, the drones and the missiles come from somewhere and they are hitting your installations. It is frustration. In the United States, it is frustration for the administration, and it is frustration because the outcome that was expected, which was a total surrender, has not been realized. You know, I've listened to what President Trump has said recently regarding Israel, that Israel is irritating me by imagining that they can achieve all their desires by destroying buildings, which means he's also tired of this scorched earth method that the Israelis use in Gaza and they are now using in southern Lebanon. Because to what end? This is the question that is being asked. I think the US administration is now beginning to ask the question. We were drawn into a conflict for a particular reason, so we imagined. But the goals are shifting on a daily basis. And the persons who drew us into this war appear to be impervious to reason and logic. They don't see what we are saying. And I think that is the irritation of the United States of America, so that even when they are in Islamabad, and then they move from Islamabad and go to Switzerland and have the direct negotiation, not between the government of Lebanon, but negotiations between the Israelis and Hezbollah. It tells you that the Americans are saying, we want this thing to end. And they have succeeded in persuading the Beirut administration. We know that Hezbollah is not considered to be a part of your administration, but if this can stop the war, please. And that is how this truce was entered into. So in a nutshell, we see an America that is progressively getting irritated, and the irritation comes at several levels. Number one, they are irritated because the war appears to be an unending war and is not achieving the desired purpose. Number two, the war appears to be alienating the United States of America from its traditional allies in Europe. Number three, the war appears to be compromising America's diplomatic leverage internationally. And number four, at the domestic level, the war appears to be affecting the economy in a very direct way in terms of consumer goods. And the Americans are getting irritated. And that is why when they talk about the midterm election, they are worried that the manner in which they have prosecuted the war may make the MAGA group lose the elections and therefore make the Republicans irrelevant in American politics in the short to medium term. When you read the Balfour Declarations of the 1907 and then the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 with people like David Ben-Gurion, the philosophy of the creation or underpinning the creation of Israel was domination. And when you have that as the philosophy, then you are in a problem. Remember that there are people who suggested as early as 1948 that you have two states, the Jewish state and the Palestinian state. And we also remember that there have been many accords, the Oslo Accord, which is suggested and prescribed that you should have many states. After that, you have the Abrahamic Accords, which brought in all these Arab countries and the Israelis. But the Israelis want to be the dominant force. And the dominant force militarily, the dominant force economically, and remember, they always remind the United States of America, we are the only democracy in the Middle East. We are therefore the Middle East anchor for what is called in the conceptual West, the free world. And because we are in that region, we are the only country that can stop other countries from acquiring military prowess by acquiring nuclear armaments. And in this regard, they are talking about Iran. And progressively, they are also mentioning Turkey, because they also think that Turkey is a country that must be watched. So Israel cannot be controlled because, in my view, the Jewish lobby in the United States of America is strong. The Jewish lobby is very strong. And I may be mistaken in this regard, but history does support my interpretation that they have always ensured that Israel is at the very upper percentile of United States foreign relations. And therefore, Israel is a spoiled child. When it asks for eggs, you give eggs. When it asks for sausage, you give sausage. Whatever it asks for, it gets. And when you refuse, it feigns to be very sick. Then you come again and say, Daddy, Mommy, we must make you happy. And it knows that. It sulks, and when it sulks, America wakes up. And they have been sulking. But the time is coming when the people are now getting tired. Unfortunately now, and I think the Israelis have found themselves in a bind. If allow me to be Shakespearean, in the book, the play Macbeth, it is said that they had waded so deep into blood that to go forth is as tedious as to go backwards. And I think the Israelis have waded so deep into this blood that to go back is as tedious. After the 7th of October, the year 2023, Israel does not know, the Netanyahu administration does not know, in my view, how to run a government without war. So it's become a war economy. They don't know in peace. And you can see whenever you want to solve one problem, whether it's in Gaza or you want to in the West Bank or you want to solve the Lebanon one, you create war. So once you find yourselves in such a situation, it becomes very difficult. You can only succeed in alienating people, and you are alienating even your traditional friends. So Israel is the bully, and this bully has now become rogue. And because it is so rogue, there is nothing you can do. But yet I believe that the only country in the world that can bring Israel to order is the United States of America. If the United States of America were to cut the pipeline of dollars that is going to Israel, I can tell you within 1 week, Israel would be forced to withdraw from South Lebanon, they would be forced to withdraw from Gaza, and they would begin to behave. And they should, when they do that, you simply tell them, we are implementing Oslo Accords. We are implementing the Abrahamic Accords. We are implementing the Islamabad Accords and the Omani Accords and all these accords, and we go into a phase of implementation. It can be done, but it requires clarity from the United States of America, so there is no misinterpretation of the message from the United States of America. But as long as the United States of America is seen to be wavering, then they play on that, and they do it very well. The Israeli state, upon its creation, and if you look at some of the thinkers, the political theories of the state of Israel, is domination in the entire area. And the Americans were roped into this very early on. And if one were to doubt, they have always wanted to have political influence in Lebanon, who is the prime minister of Lebanon. They have always wanted to know who is in Jordan, and even going beyond that to go into Syria and into Iraq, and is divide and rule also. That you know that the Saudis are the ones who are the most populous, had most oil during that period. So what do? You tell America, in order for us to enjoy military and economic domination, let us make sure that we control the little countries. That is how you justify the bases in Qatar. That is how you justify the bases in Bahrain. That is how you justify their presence in Oman and in all these spaces. So Israel is very clear, because Israel is, in my view, animated by mortal fear of their neighbors. That is why in their military philosophy, they also have two things. What they call the preemptive defense, which means when we think you are about to attack us, we attack you. You don't have to attack us. If we imagine, then we attack you. Preemptive defense. Number two, the Samson option. The Samson option is scaremongering. They tell everybody in the neighborhood, you do not know. We have nuclear facilities, although we don't say so. If you try to destroy us, we will destroy you. So it is true that the Israeli state, and one dare say, particularly when we talk about Zionism, Zionism is expansionism. And there is no doubt that that is what they have tried to do initially in very subtle ways, through rapprochements with the different entities in the Arab world. But when that does not succeed, then it is through military might. And remember, the Americans are very easy or were very easy to recruit in that particular enterprise by being told, if you don't control the Middle East, then the Soviet Union then and Russia now will control. So that is their motivation. We can't leave it to the Russians. We can't leave it to the Chinese. And of course, we know after the World War II, the Europeans do whatever it is that the Americans want. So whenever I'm talking about Europe, America, I'm also, without saying so, including the Europeans until very recently when there is a fallout. And I think that the biggest Zionist in the recent past is Benjamin Netanyahu. He is the one who really represents this expansionism. You did not see that in Shimon Peres. You did not see that in Yitzhak Rabin, or you did not see that in Menachem Begin. But whenever there has been a Netanyahu administration, it is domination, it is expansion. When you think about the international economic relations, one can dare say, and the pun is intended, that the Americans and the Israelis are playing Russian roulette with the situation that we find in the Middle East. And this is something that can be very dangerous, because there will one day be a tipping point, particularly because when you engage in activities such as blockades, when you sanction countries, you sanction Russia, you sanction China, you sanction Iran, you say you cannot buy so and so's oil, you determine who buys and who sells. There may come a time when people say, let the chips fall where they may, and let this thing be sorted out once and for all. If you look at the philosophy behind the wars throughout history, it has been because diplomacy to prevent war has failed. Then you engage in war, then you engage in diplomacy to stop war. That is, is the tragedy and the irony of it all, that all wars are ended by diplomacy. And diplomacy to prevent war is almost something that is a circle that goes on in human affairs. When countries are seeking dominance, you can now see in the world that the whole idea behind BRICS is to break that dominance, and this can be seen as economic and diplomatic efforts. But when those fail, then military might is what is deployed. One hopes that we do not cross the Rubicon. You know, whenever I think about the war in Russia and Ukraine, in the very early days, somebody asked me, do you think there will be a war? I said no. And that was in the early days in the year 2014 during the Crimean crisis. And I think I said no, I don't think there will be one. Then I, as a good student of history, so I imagined to myself, went into some of the early negotiations between NATO and in the early days, the Soviet Union, then the Russian Federation, and saying, we'll not move to the east. And then progressively one started seeing countries in the former Soviet Union moving and gravitating towards the European Union and NATO. And the dangers were obvious, that once you do that, you then have military installations in the countries such as Ukraine, you then have the European Union, and you have Lithuania and the Baltic states. Even then, I thought that the European powers, the European nations would not go the extra mile, and that the Americans would also not urge Ukraine. Then there came Zelensky. And I think Zelensky, when he came in, misinterpreted and misunderstood the situation, with the consequence that, in my view, the Russians also overreacted. overreacted in the sense that they started prosecuting what they thought would be a short military enterprise. But history has demonstrated that when a people are fighting for their survival, it is not easy to subdue them. And I think that the Europeans then saw the opportunity, what they have always wanted, to have a proxy war with Russia. And I think what we are seeing now is actually a proxy war. I believe that if the European powers, and I'm talking about France, I'm talking about Germany, I'm talking about the United Kingdom to a certain extent, and even the little ones which are not offering much military support, like the Scandinavian countries, if they stop supporting Ukraine, negotiations would happen very quickly. But because they are offering support, because they are offering material support, because they are offering military and logistical and intelligence support, then Ukraine has the appetite to continue the war. On its part, Russia is also saying, oh, it is not Ukraine that we are fighting. We are fighting the entire Western world, including the United States. And for that reason, we are not going to enter into any negotiation without certain guarantees. And in order to ensure that that proxy war goes on, only in the recent past, I think in the month of May, or in the month of May, and even early June, the Europeans were saying from Brussels that we are prepared to continue negotiations on how Ukraine joins the European Union in the midst of war. So that is the problem that I think is leading to the prolongation of this war. Trump, in this regard, appears to understand President Putin and the Russians a little better. And that is why, despite some of the quiet subterranean maneuvers that we see from the continent of Europe, the Americans have always said, we want direct negotiations. And I may be right or wrong in this regard, but I think both countries are now beginning to realize that there is a stalemate of sorts. Russia is too big, you can only shake it, but you cannot quite destroy it. But Ukraine has been destabilized. And I've used this analogy before, that when you try to shake a baobab tree, what ends up shaking are your buttocks. And I think Ukraine now finds herself in this situation. It may attack through drones this or that oil installation, this or that apartment in Russia, but look at the disruption of life in most of Ukraine. And its economy is an economy that can no longer withstand this kind of devastation. So, in a nutshell, I say it is unfortunate that this war is going on. I thought for one moment that when Zelensky wrote a letter to President Putin and said, I want direct negotiation, that ought to have been reciprocated. Because I think it was a demonstration on the part of Zelensky, we are tired. These mediators are not going to help us. Let us meet face to face, mano a mano, and let us resolve our issues. And I hope that their efforts, particularly one would hope that the United Nations is clutching on those with a view to entering the arena as a mediator without taking sides, so that they press Zelensky on direct negotiations with President Putin. And in that way, we may very well have a truce, an armistice. And when I talk about an armistice, and the North Koreans and South Koreans are still technically at war since 1953. You can't do that. And I think that that is what is desirable. But as long as you allow the Europeans from Brussels to dictate terms from Kyiv, this situation will not be stopped as quickly as we want it to be stopped. When the Americans put their foot down, and I remember this conversation which didn't turn out very well between President Trump and Zelensky, he told Zelensky, please, check what you are doing. Do you want to be responsible for a third world war? And when they went back to Kyiv, things kind of quietened down. But the Europeans are stroking him, saying, go on, we are behind you. But if the Americans were to come down on Zelensky, I believe that he will play ball. The question is, will they? The question is there diplomatic consistency in the United States? Because sometimes when I listen to the Foreign Secretary of the United States of America, Marco Rubio, he worries me more than Trump. He's an outsider who weeps more than the bereaved. So this is when you needed a master negotiator who understands the dynamics. But I'm happy now that in the United States of America, the Senate is beginning to stir up and beginning to appreciate that all these conflicts are not in the best interest of the world. The attitude of the bureaucrats and the politicians from Brussels is, in my view, misguided. If you look at some of the prediction that they made, they said that the ruble would be 200 to the dollar. That has not come to pass. They thought that Russia would not sell its oil, that the economy of Russia would produce. But what has happened instead? I think Russia has learned to live much better internally without reliance on the Europeans, even in terms of the sale of gas. So those who are advising the bureaucrats and the politicians from Brussels had better tell them that Russia is too big to be ignored. They are in your neighborhood. You have a friend in the United States, which is sometimes hot and cold. The wisdom demands that you have a rapprochement with Russia and use their resources, use their gas, use their other things, use their fertilizers. Easier said than done, but I think that is what ought to happen. But remember that Europe is also going through a very interesting phase in terms of extreme rights. The emergence of parties which are extreme right is something that cannot be ignored. And that, I think, is going to define how Western Europe relates with Russia, whom they have had a morbid fear for over the years. So it's not just about to be overturned, but there are certain types of leaders in Europe now that are kind of giving me the confidence that there is room for looking at things differently. If you see what is happening in Spain, the Spaniards are beginning to think very differently. If you see what is happening in Italy, if you see what is happening with the resignation of the UK, it tells you that they are also not very stable, the resignation of their prime minister. The other countries like the Netherlands, Denmark, and the Scandinavians and Finland, those ones are not the real anchors. The Germans are quiet. History does not allow them to make noise. The noise maker is the French President Emmanuel Macron. But he too is beginning to discover, as African countries, some African countries are abandoning them, that France, the only strength they have is that there is a nuclear power. But remember that they have lost all their bases in Africa, except now in Djibouti and Kenya where they have a president, and Djibouti where they have a base. But we are seeing a Europe that is changing. And if Europe changes and the politics of Europe changes, then I think diplomatically, it may very well send a clear message to countries like Ukraine, to countries like the Baltic Sea countries, the little Baltic countries, that you had better engage with Russia a lot more positively. And China, to our credit, is engaging in quiet diplomacy. And I think that is a role that if it played a lot more creatively, then it would help in the process of creating this rapprochement. India also is playing that role, but doesn't come out as strongly as it should. And that is why you saw it is Pakistan rather than India that mediated the the Iran-Israeli-America war. So many moving parts. But I think ultimately what is going to happen is that Western Europe is going to realize you cannot destroy the Russian Federation. You cannot wish it away. It is there, therefore do business with them. If you look at the history of any country, it is informed by that history. And countries such as the United Kingdom have started from absolute monarchs. They went through stages, and the political parties in those countries stand for something. And when, therefore, you are a leader of a political party, you are answerable to your political party and also answerable to the electorate in terms of delivery. And therefore, occupation of public office is not a life and death issue. African leaders, or if you want to call them leaders, think it is a life and death issue. Because in Africa, occupation of public office is also is like winning a lottery. When you become the president of an African country, if you are a pauper, then you become a multi-millionaire immediately. And then, of course, you begin to take things from public coffers. So you fear. You must remain in office because you fear that if you leave office, you will be pursued. So the only thing that must arise in Africa, the lesson to be learned from acts such as those, is that leadership is not about life and death. It's about playing your part. And if the people say you are not playing it very well, you pass over the baton and go and take beer, if it is beer you want, or go and do something else. But in Africa, African politicians ask you, what do I do when I leave office? But what were you doing before you got into office? Go and do that thing, or find something else more useful to do. Remember that most African countries are also running governments on the basis of systems that we imported, which we don't understand. These things also call into question, shouldn't we rethink governance? Shouldn't we rethink governance and borrow from others, but have governance systems that are responding to our reality and our needs? It is a debate that we never want to engage in. But when you are wearing a suit or a skirt that you have borrowed, it may look nice. But if you look very keenly, you'll discover that it doesn't fit very well on the shoulders. So we had better have a governance system that is informed by our realities. Only then will we begin to have leaders who know that they hold power in trust for others. That does not mean that we'll not have problems. All human affairs are attended by problems, but we'll solve them a lot better. You know, throughout history, those who have started war always imagined that they could control it from the drawing board to the battlefield. But history is consistent in demonstrating to us that the original reason for the war sometimes is forgotten, and people find themselves in a situation where they have driven so deep into the arena of war that it becomes very difficult to retreat. And this is what one sees in the wars such as those in the Middle East, the war involving Iran, even the one involving Ukraine. And it is therefore very important that we realize that when you start a war, you can never quite predict how it will pan out. Indeed, it is the very reason why after every major war, we have had multinational organizations, is to prevent war. That was the basis for the creation of the League of Nations. That was the basis for the creation of the United Nations organization after the World War II. But the other thing is that human beings appear not to learn from history. So we are stuck with this toing and froing.